Alright guys, today we're going to cover Florence. This is a continuation. We're on slide 10 from the Renaissance slides, and I wanted to try to finish out as many as we can throughout this lesson. What you need to know about Florence is it's located slightly north of the center of Italy. It grew wealthy and powerful as a center of banking and manufacture of textiles. So, though the city became known for producing some of the finest wool cloth in Europe, it gained greater renown, became really known as Europe's premier financial center. So, think of banking and money. The Florentine bankers transacted all of the financial business for the Vatican. Because of this, the popes often granted the city special privileges to other areas as well. Florence became so successful as a financial center that it was able to issue a gold florin, which was a coin that became a widely recognized and respected international medium of currency. So it became world known for its currency. Florence functioned as a commune in the 12th century, and by the time of the Renaissance, the city-state was officially a republic. By the 14th century, however, the city had come to be controlled by an oligarchy of wealthy bankers and merchants. Even so, the city still clung to the Republican ideals, even though they were being run by different families. So let's talk about some of these great families from that area. When I say great, I mean very controlling. The Medici family. So this family right here, it had made its fortune in banking, effectively controlled the government of Florence for much of the 15th century. The first great ruler from this family dynasty was Cosimo de Medici. He assumed power in 1434 and held it until his death in 1464. Though Cosimo's family held the reins of authority, he wisely chose to exercise that authority in a behind-the-scenes fashion so as to preserve the appearance that Florence was a republic. He held no formal title as a ruler, he didn't lead an extravagant lifestyle, and he didn't publicly flaunt his powers. He really wasn't out to say, hey, look, I'm rich, I'm powerful, I'm the guy in charge. But Cosimo also established the Medici's reputation as Italy's premier patron of the arts. That you need to know. They were the ones who really wanted to pay for and push the artist to create these amazing things. Supporting figures like Donatello and Fra Angelico. He also funded several important building projects in Florence, including the construction of Brunelleschi's dome and the Florence Cathedral. He founded the first public library in Europe at the monastery of San Marco. So they really put money into educating and showing, and it was their way of showing everybody that they had money and they had power without killing people or basically taking control of the government. Let's talk about Lorenzo. Alright, Lorenzo de Medici. Lorenzo was Cosimo's grandson. He came to power in 1469. What you need to know about Lorenzo is he was very big into the arts. Okay? He was considered the greatest patron of literature and the art that any prince had ever been. He was also very popular among the people of Florence, who called him Lorenzo the Magnificent. But his power was not one that would be promoted in all realms. Everyone didn't like him. There were many who did not. In fact, there was an event called the Pazzi Conspiracy in 1478 where they tried to kill Lorenzo and ended up killing his brother instead. Pope Sixtus IV had actually wanted to end the rule. So this came from one of the popes who wanted his nephew, the pope's nephew, to gain control. So you could see some issues. Because of this, there was a war that broke out. So after the failure of the Pazzi Conspiracy, the Pope enlisted Naples, its traditional ally, to attack Florence. And fighting continued from 1479, with Florence gradually weakening. In December of the year, Lorenzo decided to go to Naples and negotiate directly with the Neapolitan king. Okay. This was very risky, but it did end up paying off. And in Naples and Florence came to a settlement in February 1480 that ended the war. So from then until Lorenzo's death in 1492, Florence enjoyed a period of peace, actually. So they were able to work out their differences, come to some agreement, and both of them maintained most of their power. Alright guys, welcome back. We have Girolamo Savonarola. Okay, Florence in the 1490s, it came under influence of Dominican friar, this guy, Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola began to make a name for himself at a monastery at San Marco and preached against what he characterized as sinfulness and immorality of life in Florence. He especially criticized this Medici family for corruption, extravagant lifestyles, and even in Florence, he called them pagans because of their support of artists who created secular works. So they created these sculptures in Florence that were secular; they weren't Christian, so to speak. And so he said, you know what? That proves that they are pagans. He also really upset the Medici family. So after Lorenzo's death in 1492, his son Pierre took over. But unlike his father and grandfather, Pierre was neither wise nor an effective ruler, and after Piero surrendered Florence to the invading French king, King Charles VII, in 1494, the Florentine citizens that rose up against the Medici family drove them out of the city and established a new constitution that, while it was somewhat democratic in form, it incorporated many of Savonarola's religious ideas. From his point, Savonarola was in effect the ruler. So now everyone's following his ideas, what he wants to do. So, hey, he might be in charge of everything. But the Florence became much more strict and more pious here. Even the police officers began charging people and enforcing morality. Like, you began to get charged for being immoral. And in 1497, Savonarola and his followers carried out what was called the Bonfire of Vanities. You need to write that one down. Bonfire of Vanities. They took up luxury items, books that were written by immoral writers, pagan works of art. Think about all the amazing artwork we have today from this time period, and now imagine how much more we'd have if these people didn't burn it all. But this began to make the people want to work together, but it led to his downfall. Savonarola's conflict with Pope Alexander VI and his refusal to obey orders from Rome. So he began seeing himself as powerful, but not obeying the Pope, and that led to him being excommunicated. And the citizens were also really fed up with his repressive regime. Even though many of them followed him, they began to get tired of having to deal with all of his rules, all of his regulations. And in the end of his life, he ended up being hung, and his body was burned as well. Which is interesting that he took time to burn all the books and all the works of art at that time. He himself ended up being burned as well. You may want to write that on your notes. Alright, let's talk about Rome and the Papal States. Remember, Papal's talking about the Pope control, the control of the popes. So these popes during the Renaissance were both heads of the Catholic Church and political rulers who governed Rome and the territories that Rome controlled. They were known as Papal States. The area as a whole included much of central Italy. For the most of the 14th century, the papacy had been relocated to the city of Avignon in France. This had weakened the political power of Rome and its ability to govern the various city-states that made up the Papal States. But once the papacy returned to Rome for good in the early 15th century, the Renaissance popes had to spend a great deal of effort rebuilding Rome's political authority. So holding the Papal States together as a political entity and preserving the power of the Papal States among the major city-states of Italy was not an easy task. This made the papacy more political. Basically, they went from leading the churches to leading the governments. Many other developments also came to be more secular in the way that they were leading these areas. One of which you notice is possibly the artwork. So if you think the Medici family was getting all these patrons, they were patrons of the art and paying these artists to create wonderful artworks. Well, now the church was in power. And the church continued that tradition of paying people to create great artworks. Several of the popes during this time really spurred on this build-up. Perhaps the first real Renaissance pope was Nicholas V. He lived from 1400s to 1447 to 1455. He brought sorry, that was his, not his lived, that was his reign of powers, 1447, 1455. He brought many of the notable artists and scholars to Rome and also founded the Vatican Library. Pope Sixtus IV, we've heard his name before, he commissioned the building of the Sistine Chapel and the Sistine Bridge, which spanned the Tiber River to connect the Vatican with the heart of the city of Rome. So if you don't know what the Sistine Chapel is, please look it up and look at all the pictures. It should be something you all know. Then we go to Pope Julius II. He had St. Peter's Basilica reconstructed as a patron of the arts. The architect Bramante, the painter Raphael, and the great artist and architect Michelangelo, whom he commissioned to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Archaeologist. That's funny. I might even leave that one in there. All right, let's talk a little more about Pope Sixtus IV. What I want you to know is these people began to argue with each other. The families wanted certain people in power, and the papal authority was no different. They wanted certain people ruling because they were going to promote their ideas. So a member of the Della Rovere family, Sixtus, was unfortunately renowned for his nepotism. So his nepotism was favoritism towards his own family. So this nepotism of his, he began naming several of his relatives as cardinals, an indirect agreeing to the Pazzi conspiracy, which tried to oust the Medici family, remember, from Florence, and replace them with his nephew. So in 1481, he encouraged Venice to attack a small city-state of Ferrara, hoping that once the Venetians won, he would be able to put another nephew in charge there. His plan, however, failed, and he died in 1484. So your word of the day is nepotism. Alright, Pope Alexander VI. Let's see if he does any better. So, Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI by bribing several cardinals to vote for him. Sounds pretty honest, right? He was famous for being one of the most corrupt and immoral popes in history. You could do some research on him and find out. Notice the difference. I'm going to switch between these slides. Between Pope Julius II's clothing and Pope Alexander VI. Yes, just a little slight difference there. He had a mistress, and through scandalous parties, he sold church offices and confiscated property from cardinals and nobles in order to enrich himself. When I say sold church offices, not like an office today where he sold the chair and the computer. He sold their position. So he went from nepotism, where we had a pope wanting to put his own family into office, to this pope saying, if you want to be part of the church, you can buy your position. He also placed his son, Cesare, in charge of the papal armies and allowed him to use the wealth and might of the papacy to carve out a kingdom for himself in central Italy. Alright, Pope Julius II. Another member of the Della Rovere family and the nephew of Sixtus IV. Julius was known as the warrior pope because he used military might to restore most of the territories in Romagna. And also Persia and Bologna, he were also returned to the Papal States. He was also active diplomatically, orchestrating multi-country wars, first against Venice, then against the French. So Pope Julius, what you need to know about him is he was the warrior type. So we have the family man, we have the politician man who's selling political position, and then we have the warrior type. Now, I wouldn't say by looking at him he looks like the warrior type, but you never can judge a guy by his hat, right? Speaking of hats,